The storm was a wild beast tearing at the throat of the Idaho wilderness. Rain fell in silver sheets, and thunder cracked like a celestial whip, each peal shaking the very timbers of Owen Black's forge. Inside, the heat was a familiar comfort, a dragon's breath against the tempest. But tonight, the fire offered no solace. It only illuminated the ghosts that danced in the shadows. A gust of wind tore at the poorly latched door, wrenching it open with a violent shudder. The storm lunged inside, a cold, wet predator. It swept across the anvil, scattering sketches and tools, and snatched the one thing Owen could not bear to lose. A small, half-finished songbird, forged from salvaged steel, was lifted from the workbench and spun out into the raging night. No, the sound was a ragged whisper in his mind, a voice he hadn't used in 3 years. Not since the fire. He lunged after it, his powerful frame moving with a blacksmith's grace. He burst onto the muddy bank of Serenity Creek, a raging torrent that was usually a gentle murmur. The metal bird, a painful memento for the son he'd never see grow, bobbed in the churning water, a dark speck in the chaos. Without a second thought, Owen plunged in. The cold was a shock, a physical blow that stole the air from his lungs. The current grabbed him, pulling him downstream with savage force. He fought against it, his arms pumping, his eyes fixed on the glint of steel. He reached, his fingers brushing the bird's wing, just as a log, unseen in the maelstrom, slammed into his side. Pain exploded in his ribs. The world tilted, a dizzying swirl of black water and flashing lightning. His hand, searching blindly, closed not on cold metal, but on the delicate, yielding fabric of a dress. For a moment, confusion warred with instinct. Then he pulled. The weight was slight, but it was a dead weight, offering no resistance. He hauled it toward him, his muscles screaming in protest. In the next flash of lightning, he saw her, a woman, her face as pale as river stone, her dark hair fanned out around her like a shroud. The bird was gone. He had found something else entirely. With a final, desperate heave, he dragged her from the water, collapsing onto the muddy bank beside her. He was a large man, forged as strong as the steel he worked, but the river had nearly claimed him. He lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, the rain plastering his hair to his face. The woman was unnervingly still. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. He found one, faint and thready, but there, adrenaline surged through him again, overriding the pain in his side. He gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost childlike. He carried her back to the forge, the roaring fire a beacon in the storm. He laid her gently on a pile of clean burlap sacks near the hearth, her sodden dress pooling water on the stone floor. As he worked to revive her, pressing on her chest to expel the water from her lungs, he noticed something clutched in her right hand. Prying her cold fingers open, he found a small, ornate piece of gold, the empty setting for a jewel. It was bent, as if it had been torn from a necklace or a brooch in a struggle. Her other hand was empty. She sputtered, a weak cough racking her small frame. Water trickled from the corner of her mouth. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. They were the color of moss, dazed and terrified. She tried to scramble away from him, a small, wounded animal, but she was too weak. Owen held up his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. He backed away slowly, giving her space. Her eyes darted around the forge, taking in the massive bellows, the glowing coals, the racks of tools that could look like instruments of torture to a frightened stranger. He saw the moment fear solidified into panic. He grabbed the slate he used for orders and chalked a single word, safe. He held it up for her to see. She stared at the word, then at him, her breathing ragged. The gash on her temple, just below the hairline, was bleeding sluggishly. He hadn't noticed it in the rain. It spoke of violence, not just an accident. He pointed to the wound, then to the clean cloths and a bucket of water near the quenching trough. He mimed tending to it, his movements slow and deliberate. She watched him, her fear warring with a desperate need. After a long moment, she gave a barely perceptible nod. He approached her as he would a spooked horse, making no sudden movements. He gently cleaned the gash, his large, calloused hands surprisingly tender. As he worked, he saw the fine quality of her dress, now ruined. It was silk, intricately embroidered, not the garb of a local farm girl. When he finished, he gestured to the dry clothes folded on a nearby chest, his late wife's. They would be too large for this wisp of a woman, but they were warm and dry. She understood, and with a shy, downward glance, she accepted them. Owen turned his back, affording her privacy, his mind racing. Who was she? How did she end up in the river during a storm, clutching a piece of broken jewelry? When he heard a soft shuffle, he turned back. She was wrapped in his wife's woolen dress, which hung on her like a sack. She had moved to the small window, her gaze fixed on a clay jar holding a cluster of wild lilies he had picked that morning. They were the only spot of color in the stark, masculine space. He picked up the slate again and wrote, "What is your name?" She looked from the slate to his face, a deep, furrowed confusion in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She shook her head, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking despair. She didn't know. The knock at the door was sharp, authoritative. It made them both jump. Sheriff Brody, the late burning forge, would be a beacon in the small town of Serenity Creek. Owen moved to the door, placing himself between it and the woman. "Owen, you in there?" Brody's voice was a low rumble. "Saw your light. Everything all right?" Owen opened the door just enough to see the sheriff's rain-slicked coat and weary face. He gave a nod. Brody, however, peered past him, his eyes immediately finding the small, trembling figure by the window. "Sweet heavens, Owen, what have you got there?" The sheriff pushed the door open and stepped inside, bringing the damp scent of the storm with him. "Where'd you come from?" Owen pointed toward the river. "Pulled her out of the creek?" Brody's gaze swept over the woman, taking in her bare feet, the oversized dress, the fresh bandage on her head. "She in some kind of trouble?" The woman shrank back, wrapping her arms around herself. Owen shook his head, then picked up the slate and wrote, "No memory." Brody read the words, his mustache twitching as he processed the information. He looked from Owen to the woman and back again. "Amnesia? You sure she's not just playing dumb? Could be a runaway wife, or worse." Owen's expression hardened. He shook his head again, more forcefully this time. The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his face. "All right, Owen, I trust your judgment. For now. But, as well as I do, trouble has a way of finding its way to Serenity Creek. A woman appearing out of nowhere with no name. It feels like the beginning of something." He looked at the woman one last time. "You let me know the second she remembers anything. Or the second anyone comes looking for her." With a final, cautionary nod, the sheriff left, closing the door against the abating storm. Owen turned back to the woman. She was still staring at the lilies, as if they were the only anchor in her sea of confusion. He picked up the slate one more time. He pointed to the flowers, then wrote a new word beneath the question about her name. "Lily." She looked at the word, then at him. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She nodded. For now, it would have to be enough. He gestured for her to take his bed in the small loft above the forge, while he would sleep on the burlap sacks near the hearth. She climbed the ladder, her movements slow and weak. Owen banked the fire for the night, the familiar task a small comfort in the face of the profound mystery that had washed up on his shore. He settled onto the sacks, the rifle he always kept close now seeming more necessary than ever. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. He closed his eyes, the image of the metal bird lost to the current replaced by the haunting image of moss-green eyes filled with a terror he could only imagine. Just as he was drifting off, a sound from the loft startled him. A small, choked cry. "Don't!" The word was a desperate, fragmented plea, sharp with a fear that was all too real. Then, silence. Owen lay in the darkness, his hand gripping the cold stock of his rifle. Sheriff Brody was right. This was the beginning of something. And whatever trouble had thrown Lily into that river, he knew with a cold certainty, it was not finished with her yet. Lily woke to the smell of coal smoke and something else, something earthy and metallic that clung to the rough spun blanket against her cheek. For a disorienting moment, the terrifying void of her memory was filled only by sensation. The hard pallet beneath her, the cool air on her face, the low, rhythmic breathing from the floor below. She sat up, her head throbbing in a dull, persistent rhythm. Below her, in the flickering glow of the banked fire, lay the blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man, even in repose. His broad shoulders and powerful limbs relaxed in sleep. The rifle lay beside him, a silent sentinel. The sight should have terrified her, but it didn't. His stillness was not the stillness of a predator lying in wait, but of a great, weary bear settled in its den. He had saved her. He had written the word safe. She clung to that one solid fact in the swirling chaos of her mind. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the grimy windows, painting the forge in shades of gray and silver. The man stirred, his movements slow and deliberate as he woke. He didn't look up at the loft, but went about his morning routine with a quiet efficiency that was both fascinating and intimidating. He added wood to the fire, set a pot of coffee to brew, and measured oats into a pan. His silence was absolute, a physical presence in the room. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a choice. He must have known she was awake, for after a few moments, he retrieved the slate and chalked a simple question. "Hungry?" He held it up, his expression unreadable. Lily nodded, her stomach clenching with a hunger she hadn't realized was there. She descended the ladder, her legs still unsteady. The oversized dress made her feel like a child playing dress-up. He gestured for her to sit at the small, sturdy table while he served the porridge. It was plain but warm, and she ate with a ravenousness that embarrassed her. He sat across from her, sipping his coffee, his eyes not on her, but on the fire, as if lost in thoughts she couldn't begin to guess. A knock at the door made her jump, spilling a few drops of porridge on the table. Owen looked up, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Concern? In his eyes before his face settled back into its stoic mask. He opened the door to reveal a woman with flour on her apron and kind, worried eyes. "Owen," she said, her voice a warm, welcome sound in the silent forge. "Sheriff Brody told us what happened. We were all so worried." She held out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I brought fresh bread. Figured you two might need it." Her gaze found Lily, and her expression softened with compassion. "You poor dear. Are you all right?" Lily could only nod, feeling a lump form in her throat at the woman's simple kindness. Owen accepted the bread with a nod of thanks. The woman, who introduced herself as Martha, the baker's wife, didn't linger, but her parting words hung in the air. "It's good to see your forge being used for something other than work, Owen. It's been too long since this place saw any life." After she left, Owen returned to his work, leaving Lily to her own devices. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil became the new heartbeat of the room. It was a powerful, honest sound, a sound of creation. Lily found herself drawn to it, not repelled by it. She wandered the forge, a ghost in a borrowed dress, her fingers tracing the surfaces of tools she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The logic of their design, their purpose, felt innate, a whisper of a life she couldn't remember. Her exploration led her to his workbench. It was a landscape of steel and iron, horseshoes, hinges, a complex gear for the gristmill. But amidst the rugged, practical items sat something else entirely. It was a locket, half-finished, shaped like a delicate wildflower with overlapping petals. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the lines so fine they seemed etched by a jeweler, not hammered by a blacksmith. It was a piece of poetry in a world of prose. Without thinking, her hand reached for it. The metal was cool against her fingertips. She picked it up, her thumb tracing the intricate curve of a petal. And the world fractured. It wasn't a memory, not a clear picture, but a violent cascade of sensation. The scent of roses, overwhelmingly sweet and thick, filled her nostrils. A woman's voice, warm and loving, humming a lullaby she almost knew. The color blue, a vibrant, cornflower blue, flashed behind her eyes. Then, terror. The sweet scent of roses turned cloying, suffocating. The lullaby was cut short by a man's harsh, angry shout. The feeling of running, of twigs and branches tearing at her dress, of her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Give it back!" The voice was a guttural roar in her mind. A scream tore from her throat, thin and ragged. She stumbled backward, the locket falling from her grasp. A rack of tongs and chisels crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. The hammering stopped. In an instant, Owen was there, his large hands gripping her shoulders to steady her. He looked from her terrified face to the fallen locket on the floor. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a sudden, sharp understanding. He gently guided her to a stool, his touch surprisingly steady. He knelt before her, his large frame a solid presence against the dizzying spin of her fear. He saw the tears streaming down her face, the way she trembled uncontrollably. This was no act. The terror was real, a phantom from a past she couldn't name. He picked up the locket, then retrieved his slate. He wrote 2 words, holding them up for her to see. "You remember?" She tried to answer, to explain the chaotic fragments, but she couldn't. Sobs choked her words. She could only shake her head, a gesture of desperate denial that was also a confirmation. She didn't remember, but she had felt. Owen's expression was a mixture of compassion and something else. A deep, resonant sorrow. He understood this kind of pain, the kind that lived in the blood and bone long after the wound had closed. He helped her to her feet and guided her toward the ladder to the loft. Her legs barely held her. He gestured for her to lie down and rest, his silent command as gentle as it was firm. She collapsed onto the pallet, the storm of phantom sensations leaving her utterly spent. She curled into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around herself, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Down below, Owen stood over his workbench, the half-finished locket in his palm. The songbird he had lost to the river had been a tribute to a past he could never reclaim. This locket, he now realized, was something far more dangerous. It was a key to the identity of the woman sleeping above, a key to the violence that had thrown her into his life. He looked at the locket, its delicate petals seeming to mock him with their silent secret. He had started it as a way to practice the fine, detailed work his hands had once been known for, before the fire had scarred more than just his throat. Now, it was a trigger, a conduit to a past so traumatic it had shattered Lily's mind. He picked up a small, fine-pointed hammer. He could finish it. He could carefully chase the last details into the metal, attach the clasp, and present it to her. It might be the act of kindness that unlocked the prison of her amnesia. It could give her back her name, her life. Or it could be a death sentence. Whatever horror she had fled, whatever man had roared, "Give it back," would not have simply given up. Finishing the locket, helping her remember, could be like lighting a beacon, summoning the darkness she had so narrowly escaped right back to his forge, to his quiet, solitary world. It would endanger not only her, but him as well. He held the hammer poised over the locket, his knuckles white. The fate of the moss-eyed woman rested in the balance of his next strike. For 3 years, he had forged only things that were useful, things that were safe. Now he was being asked to forge a memory, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it would be the most dangerous thing he had ever made. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of quiet caution. The storm in Lily's mind had receded, leaving behind a fragile calm, like the still, sunlit air after a tempest. She moved about the forge with the hesitant grace of a fawn, her fear now a constant, low hum beneath the surface rather than a sharp, paralyzing shriek. She never went near the workbench where the locket lay, as if a physical boundary of terror surrounded it. Owen watched her from the corner of his eye as he worked. He saw how she flinched at the sound of a horse passing on the road, how her gaze would dart to the door whenever a shadow fell across it. The world outside the forge was a threat, and this small, smoky space had become her only sanctuary. His silence, which had once been a wall to keep the world out, had now become a part of that sanctuary, a space where she wasn't forced to answer questions she couldn't even ask herself. He had made a decision. In the dead of night, while she slept her fitful sleep in the loft, he had picked up the locket. His hands, accustomed to the brute force required to shape iron, moved with an almost reverent gentleness. He would finish it, not to force her memory, but to give her a choice. To leave it unfinished was to leave her adrift, a prisoner of the phantoms that haunted her. To complete it was to offer her a key. What door it opened, and what lay behind it, was a risk he was now willing to take. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was the keeper of her one fragile hope. He began to work on it only in small increments, during the day, when the clang of his larger projects could mask the delicate tink-tink-tink of the fine-point hammer. The sound, he noticed, didn't seem to frighten her. Instead, she would often pause her small, self-appointed tasks, sweeping the stone floor, organizing loose nails into clay pots, tending to the wild lilies, and watch him. Her moss-green eyes would follow the intricate dance of his hands, a flicker of something, recognition, fascination. In their depths, she began to help. It started with a simple gesture. He was struggling to hold a hot piece of iron steady with the tongs while reaching for a tool. A small, scarred hand appeared at his side, offering the exact chisel he needed. He glanced at her, surprised. She met his gaze for a bare second before looking away, a faint blush on her cheeks. He gave a small nod of thanks and took the tool. From then on, she became his silent apprentice. She learned to work the bellows, her slight frame putting all her weight into the steady rhythm that fed the fire. She learned the names of his tools, which he would chalk on the slate for her, her memory for these new, concrete things seemingly unaffected. She would hand him the fuller, the swage, the punch, her movements becoming more confident each day. They worked together in a silent ballet, a language of gestures and shared tasks taking the place of words. In these moments, the forge felt less like a place of work and more like a home. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody's shadow fell across the open doorway. He entered without knocking, his expression grim. Lily, who was carefully stacking firewood, froze and slipped behind a rack of horseshoes, trying to make herself invisible. "Owen," Brody said, his voice low. "Got a minute?" Owen laid down his hammer and walked to the door, his body a silent shield between the sheriff and Lily. He raised an eyebrow in question. "There's a stranger in town," Brody murmured, just loud enough for Owen to hear. "Staying at the saloon, a man named Vance, sharp-dressed, cold eyes. He's been asking questions." Owen's posture stiffened. "He's looking for a woman," the sheriff continued. "Dark hair, green eyes. Says she's his runaway sister, prone to fits and delusions. Claims she stole a valuable family heirloom before she fled." Owen's gaze flickered back toward Lily's hiding place. A runaway sister. Delusions. It was a plausible story, one that would turn the town against her, make them see her not as a victim, but as a flighty, unstable woman. He offered a reward, Brody added, his distaste evident. A big one. Enough to make good people consider doing bad things. He looked Owen square in the eye. "The description fits your girl, Owen. You need to be careful. A reward that size brings out the worst in folks. Bounty hunters, opportunists. If she is who he says she is, he'll find her." Owen gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. "Just watch your back," Brody said before turning to leave. "That man, he feels like a storm coming." The sheriff's warning settled over the forge like a shroud. The fragile peace was shattered. The threat was no longer a phantom in Lily's mind. It had a name and a face, and it was in their town. After Brody left, Lily emerged from her hiding place, her face pale. She hadn't heard the words, but she had read the danger in the sheriff's demeanor and in Owen's rigid stance. She picked up the slate and wrote with a trembling hand. "Danger?" Owen hesitated. He could lie, could tell her it was nothing, but they were past that. He owed her the truth. He nodded once. Her eyes filled with a familiar terror. But this time, something else was there too. Resolve. She walked to the hearth and began to stoke the fire, her movements jerky but determined. She would not crumble. This small space was her world now, and she would help defend it. That night, Owen worked on the locket with a new urgency. He couldn't protect her from a past she didn't understand. He had to give her back her weapons, her memories, her name. Under the focused light of his lamp, he worked the final details into the metal. The wildflower design he'd started on a whim now seemed profoundly important. He etched the delicate veins onto the petals, shaped the slender stem, and fashioned a tiny, perfect clasp. The locket was complete. It was beautiful, a small, perfect thing born of fire and force, much like the woman who had inspired it. He held it in his calloused palm, the polished steel warm against his skin. Tomorrow, he would give it to her. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Lily went about her tasks, but her movements were strained, her eyes constantly flitting to the door. Owen waited until he had finished his morning work. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping high, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then he walked to the workbench and picked up the locket. He found her by the window, staring at the jar of lilies. They were starting to wilt, their bright trumpets browning at the edges. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He held out his hand, palm open. The locket lay there, gleaming in the forge's light. Lily turned, her eyes widening as she saw it. It was the object from her waking nightmare, the thing that had sent her spiraling into terror. But it was also finished. Perfect. She looked from the locket to his face, a question in her eyes. He gave a small nod, a silent offering. "This is for you, if you want it." Her hand trembled as she reached for it. For a moment, she just stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Then, with a courage that stunned him, she closed her fingers around it. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she gasped, not a scream this time, but a sharp, painful intake of breath. The scent of roses, thick and cloying, a grand staircase, spiraling upward, a flash of blue, a dress, the same cornflower blue as before, but this time she saw it hanging in a wardrobe of polished mahogany. Then, a man's face, handsome but cruel. His lips twisted in a sneer. Elias. The name echoed in the silent chambers of her mind, a key turning in a long rusted lock. She staggered, her hand flying to her temple where the old wound throbbed in sympathy. Her other hand, the one holding the locket, was clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at Owen, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. It was the terror not of the unknown, but of the remembered. "Elias," she whispered, the name a ragged, foreign sound on her lips. It was the first word she had spoken since he pulled her from the river. Before Owen could react, before he could even begin to process the significance of this breakthrough, the shadow of a man fell across the open forge door. "I see you found my property." The voice was cultured, smooth, but with an undercurrent of menace that was as cold and sharp as honed steel. Lily spun around, a choked cry escaping her lips. Standing in the doorway was the man from her vision, Elias Vance. His smile was a thin, predatory curve, and his eyes, the cold, empty eyes of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey, were fixed on the locket in her hand. Elias Vance stepped into the forge, his polished boots a stark contrast to the soot-stained stone floor. He moved with a languid grace that was more menacing than any overt threat, his gaze sweeping over the room, dismissing the tools and the fire before settling on Lily with an air of possessive ownership. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Alara," he said, his voice a silken purr that made the hairs on Lily's arms stand on end. "Running off like that. It was most inconsiderate, Alara." The name resonated within her, another piece of the shattered puzzle clicking into place. It felt right. It felt like her. But the sound of it on his lips was a violation, a brand. Owen moved instantly, placing his large body between Vance and Lily. It was a simple, protective gesture, as primal as a bear shielding its cub. He didn't pick up a weapon. He didn't need to. His sheer presence was a formidable barrier. Vance's eyes flickered to Owen, a flicker of amusement in their cold depths. "And you must be the blacksmith," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "The local hero. I do appreciate you finding my sister, though I'm not sure what primitive care you've been offering her." Lily, or Alara, shrank behind Owen, her hand clutching the locket so tightly it dug into her palm. The memories were still fragmented, chaotic, but the feeling associated with this man was crystal clear, a suffocating, bone-deep terror. She remembered his voice, not smooth and cultured, but a harsh roar in a darkened room. She remembered the bruising grip of his hand on her arm. Owen stood his ground, silent and immovable. He retrieved his slate from the workbench, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He wrote a single, clear question. "Who are you?" Vance chuckled. A dry, unpleasant sound. "I am Elias Vance, her concerned brother-in-law. My dear Alara has been unwell since the tragic death of her husband, my brother. She is prone to these flights of fancy, these episodes where she forgets who she is. It is my duty to care for her, to bring her back to the safety of her home." He looked past Owen, his eyes locking with Alara's. "Isn't that right, my dear?" Alara could only shake her head, a small, desperate gesture. The word husband was a blank, a void. But brother-in-law felt like a lie. This man was no protector. He was the source of her terror. "You've been very kind, Blacksmith," Vance continued, his tone shifting, becoming brisk and businesslike. "But your services are no longer required. Alara, come here. We are leaving." She didn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the stone floor. Owen didn't move either. Vance's smile thinned, the charm evaporating to reveal the cold steel beneath. "Perhaps you didn't understand me," he said to Owen. "She is coming with me. Now." He took a step forward, his hand reaching for Alara. Owen blocked his path, He shook his head once, a slow, deliberate motion. It was a clear and final refusal. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. The air in the forge crackled with tension. Vance was the first to break, his face contorting in a brief flash of rage before he smoothed it back into a mask of civility. "I see," he said softly. "You've been poisoned by her delusions. Very well. I won't force the issue here, but know this, Blacksmith. You are interfering in a family matter. A legal matter. The law is on my side." He glanced around the forge again, his eyes lingering on the simple cot in the loft. "And I imagine the good people of Serenity Creek will have much to say about a grown man keeping a vulnerable, confused woman in his home. It could be seen as improper, even criminal." The veiled threat was unmistakable. He wasn't just threatening Owen's reputation. He was threatening his freedom. With a final, lingering look at Alara, a look that was a promise of return, Vance turned and strode out of the forge, leaving a chilling silence in his wake. The moment he was gone, Alara's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, the locket slipping from her grasp. Sobs racked her body, not the quiet tears of confusion, but the deep, guttural sobs of remembered trauma. Owen was beside her in an instant, not touching, but just being there, a solid anchor in her storm. He waited patiently for the worst of the tempest to pass. When her sobs quieted to ragged breaths, he picked up the locket and placed it gently in her lap. Then he retrieved the slate. "He is lying." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of faith. She looked at the words, then up at his face, her eyes pleading for him to believe her. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He wrote again, "You are safe here." The simple words were a balm to her raw nerves. She looked around the forge, at its smoky walls and scattered tools. It was a strange, stark place, but it was the only place in her fractured world that felt true. And this silent, powerful man was the only person she felt she could trust. Later that day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the forge floor, another visitor arrived. This time, it was Martha, the baker's wife, her round face creased with worry. "Owen," she said, her voice a hushed whisper, though they were alone. "That man, Mr. Vance, he's been all over town. He's at the saloon now, buying drinks for anyone who will listen, telling them a sad story about his poor, sick sister-in-law and the brutish blacksmith who is holding her against her will." Owen's jaw tightened. Vance was moving quickly, poisoning the well, turning the town's good-natured curiosity into suspicion and hostility. "He's painting you as a villain, Owen," Martha continued, her distress evident. "And people are starting to listen. The reward money, it's a temptation. And his story, it preys on their fears." She wrung her hands. "You need to do something. You need to tell them the truth." Owen picked up his slate, but for a long moment, he didn't write. What was the truth? That he had a woman in his home who couldn't remember her own name? That her concerned relative was a predator who terrified her? Against Vance's smooth, confident lies, Owen's silent chalk marks would seem like a confession of guilt. His silence, once a shield, was now being used as a weapon against him. Alara had been listening from the shadows of the loft. She had heard Martha's words, had seen the troubled look on Owen's face. She descended the ladder, her movements now steady, her expression no longer one of pure terror, but of a grim, newfound determination. She walked past Martha and stood before Owen. She took the slate from his hands and wiped it clean with the palm of her own. Then, with the chalk, she wrote a single word, a name, Alara. She held it up, not for him, but for Martha. It was a claim, a declaration. "I am not nameless. I am not a phantom." Then she wrote again, her hand moving with a certainty that surprised them all. "He is not my brother. He is a monster." Martha read the words, her eyes widening. She looked from the slate to Alara's face, at the fierce conviction there, and she believed. "Oh, you poor child," she breathed, her earlier worry transforming into a protective maternal anger. "That man, he has the devil's own charm." But Martha's belief, while a comfort, was not enough. The tide of opinion in Serenity Creek was turning. Later that day, a group of men, their courage bolstered by the whiskey Vance had bought them, gathered across the street from the forge. They didn't do anything, just stood there, watching, their presence a silent judgment. The forge, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. As darkness fell, Owen barred the door, a precaution he hadn't taken in years. He and Alara ate their simple meal in a silence thick with tension. The unspoken question hung between them. What do we do now? After they had eaten, Owen gestured for Alara to sit at the table. He laid out a piece of clean parchment and a stick of charcoal. He then picked up the locket, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. He pointed to it, then to the parchment, then to her. A silent command. Draw. Remember, Alara understood. He wanted her to use the locket as a key again, not just to feel, but to see. To bring the fragments out of the darkness of her mind and onto the paper. It was a terrifying prospect. The last time she had touched it, the memories had been a violent, chaotic assault. But looking at Owen's steady, encouraging face, she found a reservoir of courage she didn't know she possessed. She took the locket in one hand and the charcoal in the other. She closed her eyes, focusing on the cool weight of the metal. She let the sensations wash over her again, the scent of roses, the color blue, the angry voice. But this time, she didn't fight them. She followed them, like threads into a labyrinth. Her hand began to move across the parchment, at first slowly, then with increasing speed and confidence. She drew not what she saw in the forge, but what she saw in her mind's eye. A grand house with white columns, a sprawling garden filled with rose bushes, a sweeping staircase, a woman's face, kind of beautiful, humming a lullaby. Mother. Then the images grew darker. A man's hand, a heavy gold ring on his finger, slamming down on a table. A locked door, a window with iron bars disguised as decorative scrollwork. It wasn't a home, it was a gilded cage. She drew the face of the man who called himself Vance, but in her drawing, his handsome features were twisted into a mask of cruel fury. And beside him, she drew another man, older, with the same cold eyes but a face etched with weakness and dissipation. My husband. The word was a bitter taste in her memory. Finally, she drew the locket. But in her drawing, it was not empty. A brilliant blue stone, a sapphire, blazed at its center. And she drew a hand, her own, tearing it from her neck as she fled through the rose garden in the dead of night. She dropped the charcoal, her hand trembling, her body slick with a cold sweat. She stared at the drawings spread across the table. They were a map of her stolen life. Owen looked at the sketches, his expression grim. This was no simple family dispute. This was a story of wealth, imprisonment, and a desperate escape. The woman he had pulled from the river was not some runaway wife. She was a captive. He pointed to the drawing of the house, then looked at her with a questioning gaze. Blackwood Manor, she whispered, the name surfacing from the depths. Then, another name, more important. My name is Alara Blackwood. The name felt both strange and familiar, the final piece of a puzzle she was just beginning to understand. She was not Vance's sister-in-law. Her husband, his weak, cruel brother, was dead. Elias Vance was her guardian, the man who controlled her inheritance, the man who had kept her a prisoner in her own home. A loud banging on the forge door made them both jump to their feet. Owen Black, it was Sheriff Brody's voice, but it lacked its usual weary patience. It was sharp, official. Open this door. I have a warrant for your arrest. The sheriff's voice was a hammer blow against the fragile sanctuary of the forge. A warrant. The word was a legal cage, colder and more final than any iron bars. Alara's newfound memories curdled into sheer panic. She looked at Owen, her eyes wide with terror. This was her fault. Her past had reached out from the shadows and was now threatening to consume the one person who had shown her kindness. Owen's face was a mask of granite. He didn't look frightened, only grimly resolute. He placed a hand on her arm, a steadying pressure, before moving to the door. He didn't open it. What's the charge, Sheriff? His voice, when he finally used it, was a low, rusty rumble, startling after weeks of silence. It was the voice of a man not accustomed to speaking, but when he did, the sound carried the weight of the iron he forged. Kidnapping, Owen. Brody's voice was strained, apologetic but firm. Vance has a signed affidavit from a judge back east. Says you're holding his ward, Alara Blackwood, against her will. That you're taking advantage of her. Mental instability. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it stole the air from Alara's lungs. Vance wasn't just turning the town against them. He was using the very law as his weapon. She is here by her own choice. Owen's voice boomed, echoing slightly in the forge. That's not for me to decide, Brody called back. The warrant is legal. You have to come with me. We can sort this out in the morning. Owen looked at Alara. He saw the drawings spread across the table, the map of her gilded prison. He knew that if he went with Brody, Vance would be there, waiting to claim her. There would be no sorting it out. Vance would use his legal authority to spirit her away, back to the silence and fear of Blackwood Manor. And this time, there would be no escape. He made a decision. He would not surrender her. He turned from the door and strode to the great bellows that fed his forge. With a few powerful pumps, the embers in the hearth roared to life, casting a hellish, dancing light across the room. He then grabbed his largest hammer, its weight a familiar comfort in his hand. Owen, don't be a fool. The sheriff's voice was a mixture of frustration and genuine concern. Don't make me break this door down. You will not take her, Owen stated, his voice now clear and strong. It was a promise, an oath sworn in the heart of his forge. Outside, Brody sighed. He had his orders. All right, boys, he said to the deputies he had brought with him. Get the ram. The first blow against the heavy oak door was a deafening crack. Alara flinched, but Owen stood firm, his eyes fixed on the door, his knuckles white around the handle of the hammer. The second blow splintered the wood near the lock. On the third, the door burst inward, ripped from its iron hinges. Sheriff Brody stood in the doorway, flanked by two deputies, their faces grim in the firelight. Behind them, a crowd of townsfolk had gathered, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and the righteous anger Vance had so carefully cultivated. In the front of the crowd, his arms crossed, stood Elias Vance, a look of triumphant satisfaction on his handsome face. It's over, Owen, Brody said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Come peacefully. No, Owen said simply. He raised the hammer, not in a threatening gesture, but as a symbol of his defiance. It was a standoff, the law on one side, a silent blacksmith and a terrified amnesiac on the other. But Alara was no longer just a terrified amnesiac. The drawings, the locket, the sound of her own name, they had awakened something within her. The woman who had fled Blackwood Manor in the dead of night, who had survived the river, was not helpless. While all eyes were on Owen, she moved with a swift, desperate grace. She grabbed a heavy iron-quenching bucket, filled with water for cooling hot metal. With a cry that was a mixture of rage and terror, she hurled its contents at the roaring fire. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. A massive cloud of steam erupted from the hearth with a deafening hiss, engulfing the forge in a thick, blinding fog. Men shouted in surprise and pain as hot cinders flew through the air. The deputies recoiled, shielding their eyes. In that moment of chaos, Owen acted. He grabbed Alara's hand. Run! He rasped, his voice a raw command. He didn't run for the shattered front door, where the crowd and the lawmen were. He ran for the back of the forge, to a small, seldom-used door that led out to the steep, wooded hillside behind his property. He kicked it open and pulled Alara out into the cool night air. They're getting away! Vance's furious shout cut through the steam-filled confusion. They scrambled up the dark, pine-covered slope, their lungs burning, branches whipping at their faces. Below them, lanterns began to bob in the darkness as the sheriff and his men organized a pursuit. Shouts echoed through the trees. They were fugitives now, running not just from a man, but from the law itself. They ran until Alara's breath came in ragged sobs and she could go no further. They collapsed behind a rocky outcropping, hidden from the search party below. The sounds of the pursuit were closer now, the beam of lanterns cutting through the undergrowth. Owen knew this mountain. He had hunted its slopes for years. He knew its secrets, its hidden paths and hollows. But Vance had the law, and a posse of townsmen fueled by rumor and the promise of reward money. He looked at Alara, who was huddled beside him, trembling from exertion and fear. Her face was scratched, her borrowed dress torn. But in her eyes, he saw not the dazed confusion of the woman he had pulled from the river, but the fierce, defiant spark of Alara Blackwood. My drawings, she whispered, her voice hoarse. They're still on the table. The proof. Owen shook his head. They won't look for proof, he said, his voice a low rumble. Vance's story is simpler. It's easier to believe. He knew that Brody was a decent man, but he was a man bound by warrants and affidavits. He would follow the letter of the law, even if his gut told him it was wrong. A lantern beam swept across the rocks just above their heads. They pressed themselves flatter against the cold earth, holding their breath. The light moved on. "We can't stay here," Owen whispered. He pointed up toward the jagged silhouette of the mountain's peak against the starry sky. "There's an old trapper's cabin. A day's climb. If we can make it there before they circle around, we might have a chance." It was a desperate plan. They had no food, no water, no weapons but Owen's strength and Alara's reawakening spirit. But it was their only hope. "I can make it," Alara said, her voice finding a surprising strength. They began the arduous climb, moving through the darkness like ghosts. Below them, the lights of the search party spread out, a net of flickering lanterns closing in. Owen led the way, his knowledge of the terrain their only guide, his hand frequently reaching back to help Alara over a fallen log or a steep crevice. As dawn broke, casting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold, they paused to rest in a small cave, hidden behind a waterfall. They were exhausted, bruised, and hungry, but they were still free. Owen looked back down the mountain, toward the distant town of Serenity Creek. He had lost everything: his forge, his home, the quiet, solitary life he had so carefully constructed. In trying to save Alara, he had become as much of an outcast as she was. He looked at her, at the dirt smudged on her cheek, the fierce determination in her moss-green eyes. And he realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he regretted nothing. He had chosen connection over solitude, defiance over submission. But as he watched the distant figures of the posse beginning their slow, methodical ascent of the mountain, he knew their fight was far from over. Vance would not give up. He had the law, the money, and the town on his side. Owen and Alara had only each other, and the wild, unforgiving mountain. "He won't stop until he has me," Alara said, her voice a quiet statement of fact. "Or until one of us is dead." Owen didn't answer. He simply tore a strip of cloth from the hem of his shirt and began to gently clean a long, deep scratch on her arm. The simple, tender gesture was his silent vow. Vance would have to go through him first. The mountain would be their fortress, and the anvil of their shared ordeal would either forge them into something stronger than they had ever been, or it would break them completely. The trapper's cabin was a ghost of a place, its log walls silvered with age, its roof sagging like the shoulders of a defeated old man. But it was shelter, and it was hidden, tucked away in a narrow, pine-choked ravine near the mountain's summit. It was a place the posse, with their town-bred tracking skills, would likely overlook. They collapsed inside, the single room thick with the dust of disuse and the faint, musky scent of animals that had taken shelter there over the years. Alara sank onto a rickety cot, her body trembling with an exhaustion so profound it was a physical pain. Owen immediately set to work, his movements economical and purposeful. He secured the door with a fallen log, checked the crumbling chimney for blockages, and used his flint and steel to coax a small, smokeless fire from the dry tinder he found in a corner. For 2 days, they lived like hunted animals. They rationed the handful of berries Owen managed to find and drank from a small spring that trickled from the rocks behind the cabin. The silence between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of the forge, but a taut, watchful silence, punctuated by the snap of a twig outside or the distant cry of a hawk. On the third morning, Alara awoke from a fitful sleep to find Owen gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Had he abandoned her? Had the posse found him? She stumbled to the door and peered out into the gray dawn. He was there, standing at the edge of the ravine, a solitary, powerful figure staring down at the valley below. She approached him quietly. He didn't seem to notice her until she was standing beside him. "They're still looking," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't need to point. Far below, tiny puffs of smoke from campfires betrayed the posse's locations. They hadn't given up. They were beating the mountainside in a systematic grid. It was only a matter of time. Alara followed his gaze. From this height, Serenity Creek was a miniature town, a child's plaything. She could see the smoke rising from the forge, her forge, the place she had started to feel safe. Now it was just another part of the trap. "It's my fault," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I brought this trouble to you. You lost your home because of me." Owen turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The simple, unexpected touch sent a jolt through her. He retrieved the small, worn piece of chalk he always carried in his pocket and wrote on a flat piece of slate rock he'd found. It was not a home. It was a place to hide. The words were a revelation, a window into the deep well of his own solitude. He had been as much a prisoner as she was, chained not by a man, but by a memory, by a grief so profound it had stolen his voice. "The fire," she said softly, understanding dawning. It wasn't just an accident, was it? He looked away, back down at the valley, his jaw tight. He wrote on the rock again. "My wife, my son, I couldn't save them." The stark, simple confession was more powerful than any eloquent speech. It was the heart of his pain, laid bare. Alara felt a wave of empathy so strong it was a physical ache. They were two broken people, huddling together on a lonely mountain, hunted by the ghosts of their pasts. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "Hiding won't save us. He will never stop." Owen looked at her, a question in his eyes. "We have to go down," she said, the plan forming even as she spoke it. "Not to run, but to fight. We have to tell them the truth. Your truth. And mine." It was a mad idea. To walk back into the arms of the law, to face a town that had already condemned them. But it was the only path that led to something other than a life on the run. Owen stared at her for a long moment, then he gave a single, decisive nod. The descent was more perilous than the climb. They moved in daylight, a calculated risk, using Owen's knowledge of the terrain to avoid the main search parties. As they neared the valley floor, they heard the baying of hounds. Vance had brought dogs. Their time was running out. They emerged from the tree line not in Serenity Creek, but a mile to the east, near the baker's house. It was a desperate gamble, but Martha was their one certain ally. They found her in her yard, feeding her chickens, her face a mask of worry. Her jaw dropped when she saw them emerge from the woods, ragged and exhausted. "Dear Lord," she breathed, "we thought you were gone. We need your help, Martha," Alara said, her voice steady. "We need to get a message to Sheriff Brody, not at the jail, but at his home, and we need to get into the forge." An hour later, as twilight began to fall, a plan was in motion. Martha's son, a gangly youth of 15, was dispatched with a sealed note for the sheriff. And Owen and Alara, cloaked in borrowed coats, slipped through the back alleys of Serenity Creek, making their way to the one place they could make their stand. The forge was dark and cold, the fire long dead. Brody had posted a deputy at the front, but the back door, as Owen knew, was unguarded. They slipped inside, the familiar smells of smoke and metal a strange comfort. While Alara retrieved her charcoal drawings from where they had been scattered on the floor, Owen moved to the hearth. He didn't build a fire. He went to the great anvil that stood in the center of the room, the heart of his world. He picked up his favorite hammer. Then he began to work. The first clang of the hammer on the anvil echoed through the silent town like a thunderclap. It was a sound Serenity Creek had not heard in 3 days, a sound they had associated with the steady, silent rhythm of their lives. Now it was a summons, a challenge. He wasn't forging metal. He was forging a sound, a declaration. Each strike was a word in a language everyone understood. "I am here. I am not hiding." Lights began to appear in the windows of the houses nearby. People emerged onto their porches, drawn by the defiant, rhythmic ringing. Sheriff Brody arrived first, not with a posse, but alone. He found Owen at the anvil, his face grim, his hammer rising and falling in a steady, powerful beat. Alara stood beside the workbench, her drawings laid out like evidence in a courtroom. "Owen, what in God's name are you doing?" Brody demanded. Before Alara could answer, another figure appeared in the doorway. Elias Vance. His handsome face was a mask of cold fury. "He came back," he snarled. "The fool came back. He had 2 deputies with him, men loyal to his money, not the sheriff." "It's over, Vance," Brody said, turning to face him. "I got a note. I know about the drawings. I know her name is Alara Blackwood." "You know nothing," Vance spat. "You have the word of a deranged woman and a mute kidnapper." "I have a legal warrant." The forge was filling up now. Martha had arrived, and other townsfolk, drawn by the hammering, were crowding into the doorway, their faces illuminated by the lanterns they carried. "She's not deranged," Martha said. her voice clear and strong. She's a victim, and he's not a mute. All eyes turned to Owen. The hammering stopped. The sudden silence was more profound than the noise had been. Owen looked at the faces staring at him, the suspicious, the curious, the fearful. He looked at Vance's smug, triumphant sneer, and he looked at Alara, at her unwavering faith in him, in the man he could be. He took a deep breath, a breath that seemed to draw strength from the very stones of his forge. He opened his mouth. "My name is Owen Black," he said. The voice was rough, scarred, like a piece of iron that had been through the fire too many times. But it was a voice, clear, strong, resonant. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Elias Vance's face went pale with shock. "I did not kidnap her," Owen continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I rescued her. This man," he pointed the hammer at Vance, "is her jailer, not her guardian. He kept her a prisoner in her own home to steal her inheritance." "Lies!" Vance shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. "The proof," Owen said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "is not just in these drawings. It's in her eyes. Look at her. Does she look like a mad woman? Or does she look like someone who has been terrorized?" Every eye turned to Alara. She stood tall, her fear now replaced by a quiet, burning anger. She held up the locket. "This was a gift from my mother," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "He tried to take it from me the night I escaped. He wanted to erase every part of who I was. But he failed." The tide of opinion in the room was a palpable thing, a physical force turning against Vance. The townsfolk looked at each other, seeing the story not through the lens of Vance's money and charm, but through the raw, honest testimony of two people they had wronged. "Sheriff," Owen said, his eyes locking with Brody's, "you have a choice. You can serve his warrant, which is based on lies, or you can serve the truth." Brody looked at Vance, at the desperation and rage in his eyes. He looked at Owen and Alara, at their shared strength. He looked at the faces of his town, waiting for him to lead. "Elias Vance," the sheriff said, his voice a low, steady growl. "I'm placing you under arrest for perjury and for conspiring to kidnap Ms. Alara Blackwood." Vance laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You have no proof. You can't hold me." He lunged, not at the sheriff, but at Alara, his face a mask of primal fury. If he was going down, he would take her with him. Owen moved faster than anyone thought possible. He dropped the hammer and threw himself in front of Alara, his body a shield. Vance crashed into him, a knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. The blade plunged deep into Owen's side. Alara screamed. Owen grunted in pain but did not fall. He wrapped his powerful arms around Vance, lifting him off the ground and, with a final, desperate roar, hurled him into the glowing heart of the forge. There was a terrible, inhuman scream as flames engulfed him. Then, silence. Owen staggered, clutching his side, blood pouring between his fingers. He looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. She rushed to him, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound. "You spoke," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Owen, you spoke." He managed a faint, pained smile. "I had something to say," he rasped, before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed into her arms.